Welcome to the latest exciting episode of Ancient Geeks, a podcast about a couple of geeks talking about our younger selves, what led us into the geek life before geek became chic.
There you
And
go.
we're going to talk about science fiction writers this episode. I'm Tom Grant.
I'm Stephen Taylor.
All right. So first of all, let's talk about what sort of geeky things we've been doing lately. So what's the one geek thing you want to highlight for
So
this particular episode?
I have, for no particular reason, except I know we're going to talk about it at some point in the future, and because it's something I like to revisit, I started reading Jim Starlin's run on Captain Marvel.
Oh, nice.
From the very, very beginning. He just acquired the power cosmic, and I am waiting for, and I forget when it happens. I should remember when he finally gets disassociated from Rick Jones, because quite frankly, Rick Jones gets on my nerves after a while.
Yeah.
But it's good stuff. Thanos is there and the controller and whatnot. So that's where I am. That's my latest thing. How about yourself?
So you mentioned Blake Seven last time, so I'll
Yes.
mention it. So I am so grateful that you encouraged me to watch it, and I'm not sure why I haven't before. It was certainly something that should have been up my alley. I think that this particular vintage of, science fiction TV was something I certainly enjoyed at the time. I watched Doctor Who, and we talked about Star Trek endlessly, and but somehow I missed this, and it also, oh, by the way, the political side of it too, right? So we're both
Yeah, yeah. Political
have
science.
have a minor interest in politics, and so the political themes of that show were pretty strong, and I've seen about 5 episodes now, and I'm
Oh,
having a
great.
blast watching it.
Well, I'm glad I'm good for something. That's really what
Yes,
that's I'm this is
but
all
that's about it.
it's all about me.
Yeah,
No, I will assume that it just came out at a time maybe you were chasing girls or something. I don't know. But
yeah, that could be.
it
Or it just was availability on local TV because we were
yes.
so reliant on PBS for
Oh yeah.
all the British import television.
No, I'm glad you're finding it enjoyable, and I actually hope at some point we'll talk about it in more detail.
Yeah, I think it exemplifies why you don't need special effects to be super sophisticated to make
Oh,
something watchable.
that's absolutely the case. Because yeah, the effects are just they're not very good. And the
Yeah,
sets are kind of wacky. I do like the ship. The ship is cool looking.
right.
It's
Yeah,
different than any other
I
ship
I,
that I.
I I like I like the artificial intelligence.
Yeah, Zen is great.
Uh,
You got a lot coming up. I won't spoil it for you, but yeah, there's some
Oh,
good stuff
okay.
coming.
And I also like the very Star Trek-like control panels where nothing is labeled. It's
That's
just
right. It's
brightly colored buttons.
just buttons. Yeah, it's kind of funny if you watch. Yeah, because I was paying attention when they were first learning to use the teleport, and they're just like they clearly don't even know what the sequence is supposed to be. They're just like fooling around. Eventually, they
Oh,
finally
yeah, yeah.
come to something eventually that works, but it's or they're holding down what is clearly just a giant panel of non-pressable buttons, and they're holding down the whole panel is going down because they're just pushing. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
great.
Well, since we're on this tangent, just to
Yes.
finish it off, and we will drag it back to the topic,
Oh,
but so
sure.
there's a Star Trek PC game where you can play as the crew of the Enterprise, or
Yes.
it's actually not the Enterprise, it's another starship to start with, but it's like the movie, the modern,
Okay.
J.J. Abrams to start, and that's the
Oh,
easy setting for all the controls that you have. And then they do next generation, and they throw in different displays, the
yeah.
LCARS
Right.
displays, and some other mechanisms for controlling the ship that are new. And then the hardest mode is the original series because you have all the buttons with no labels. They conveniently let you add the like floating labels so you
Right.
can kind of know what the right thing is to push, but you can also go in the super hard mode, which is just that red button there. We'll find out
That's right.
when I push it.
Could be self-destruct. Could
I
be
don't
warp
know.
drive. Who can say?
Who can
Awesome.
say? All right. So that's our modern geekiness. Now let's go back to our ancient geekiness. What would be our musical intro for this episode? We were talking beforehand with maybe like theremin music would be the
That would be a
If
very appropriate.
right, if we could afford music, that would be what we would do for this podcast. But unfortunately, we don't yet have the funds in order to have a soundtrack. Okay, so this is going to be another flyover episode like the
Yes.
last one. Um, and we're not going to get into all the authors in detail. We're really just going to talk about the ones that were significant to us and just in general what grabbed us about science fiction at the time. We're not going to get into all the ramifications of it. I think that there were a lot of questions I think that people might have had when we were talking about fantasy, that we didn't get into even thematically above the level of the individual authors and stories. But let's just kind of start with: were you more of a science fiction guy or a fantasy guy at this time
So I
when we
think
were young?
quite clearly I was more of a science fiction person. I think we talked last week about a lot of different fantasy authors that I read, but you were clearly deeper into it than I was. Um, I think I think in some ways I thought of myself because I mean, one of the interesting things about this entire project, right, is it's in this weird biographical journey and thinking
Hmm.
back about what I did, why I did it, what appealed to me, how I thought about myself. I think I thought about myself as more of a science fiction person than a fantasy person, with with the Lord of the Rings being this again this very special and important space. But I think I really read more science fiction, and again broadly defined, as we talked about last week, however you want to define it, but having to do with space and at least in theory the future and the way in which technology applied to these circumstances would change how mankind lived or did not live, or humanity, if you'll pardon the gendered term. So that's how I would see myself. How about yourself?
So I would also think that the ratio of science fiction to fantasy favored science fiction. I don't know by how much. And in putting together my notes for this episode, I started, of course, kind of listing all the authors who were significant to me at the time. And I certainly had more science fiction authors than I had fantasy authors for the last episode. So I guess that means a significant amount, more, but I don't know if that meant, each of those authors I read more of.
Right.
I mean, there were some certainly I did, some of my favorites like Larry Niven, but I don't know.
I'm finding as I try to retrace my steps that the things that I remember more are science fiction.
Yeah.
But so
So last time we got into a discussion about science fiction, fantasy, what distinguished the two of them. We're not going to rehash that, but one question we did talk about asking was what felt like science fiction to you at the time? Like what were was it themes or tone or plots or whatever that really kind of felt like science fiction to you?
no, I think I mean, to be superly, not to be overly reductive, but spaceships were important. Interplanetary travel, this idea of going out to the stars and what that meant to civilization. And I think it's a capacity to explore ideas. I think, as I was thinking about our discussion last week, and then as I think about how this fits together in my brain, while fantasy and science fiction both are important for me in terms of like things like world building and heroes' journeys and that sort of thing, but I think science fiction to me was really more about exploring ideas and how those ideas would shape, again, the way in which humanity would develop and interact with itself. In ways that fantasy was just more about the adventure. Science fiction
Hmm.
had the adventure, but it also had this other element to it. Because again, I mean, I mentioned in passing at the end of last episode about the space race, and I think that I know I was very much influenced by the space race. I mean, and paying attention as a kid from my perspective, the moon stuff was mostly done before I became even aware of it. But the space shuttle and all that was very central to. I was the kind of kid that
Hmm.
would get up in the morning to watch the launch, and often be very disappointed that the rain had canceled the launch. And back when you could write away to maybe now you can online, but I used to write away to NASA, and they would send you all these pamphlets and whatnot about different space programs. And that was always so I had in my head this idea that we were going to go. we're going to colonize the moon, we're going to colonize Mars, we're going to learn how to lead
Hmm.
the solar system. And so all of these stories about life out there were very appealing to me.
Yeah, it was inevitable as the arc of progress that we were
Yes,
on.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would say for me it was at the time the what if question, being
Hmm.
posed, and a lot of it was about space, but it was also, other things, like what if we really did have intelligent robots, one of the big themes
Sure.
of Isaac Asimov's. It was, so the literature of big ideas with a lot of fascination for science and technology. Often in some cases I would say in some cases people were sort of treating science as a panacea, but I think that
Yes.
that would be a caricature of science fiction in general. I think that there is an awareness on the part of science fiction writers that uh, that really there could be some pernicious aspects to scientific progress as well. In fact, a
Sure.
very strong awareness of that. Um, and I think that this is the time when there was like a consciousness about, speaking of like the scientific element of it, the consciousness of there being this difference between hard science fiction where there was uh, both you were kind of playing out particular scientific ideas in the fiction as well as like like a social contract with the reader that you were going to play by the scientific rules as much as possible versus soft science fiction which worried less about that, and that was actually almost institutionalized in the magazines that existed at the time. So you had analog being the place to go if you were really an aficionado of hard science fiction, and then you had, the magazine of fantasy and science fiction or Asimov's or whatever other sources of science fiction, short stories or serialized novels or novellas or whatever. That was kind of what the how the market divided up in sources of reading.
Yeah, I think that's correct. I think I was just very taken. We mentioned this a little bit in Star Trek about what appealed to me about Star Trek, and I mentioned sort of a. I don't even mean this in a political
Mhm.
sense, although it may have political implications. Is this progressivism, as you say? It's the inevitability that technology makes life better, and therefore that leads us to new horizons. I think just the whole idea of space, the final frontier, that sentence, that phrase,
Mhm.
I think really ignited my brain and drove me through some of this literature. And then, of course, then that leads to other kinds of explorations and new kinds of
Yeah.
stories. But I think that was really kind of what it was um, that really appealed to me.
Yeah. And there's a lot. I think this is when also science fiction was balanced between short fiction and
Yes,
long form fiction. And a lot of the short fiction was because the ideas that you wanted to explore potentially didn't merit a novel.
right,
So, like, there was a story by James Tiptree that basically wanted to make the point that meeting aliens might ruin us, that we might be such a weaker party in that relationship that we almost wind up being like groupies on the fringes of galactic civilization, and not a good future for humanity in that. But you don't need to write a whole novel about that. You could
right.
write one good story and make your point and get out.
No, that's true. I mean, I think that there's a certain genre is not the right word, but there's a certain style, and I think that I was drawn to it. So yeah, this one idea story kind of thing, or trying to
Yeah.
get in and focus on that. And I think in some ways it's also what often science fiction was critiqued for was that it was not like the characters were often second fiddle to the idea.
Right. Yeah, and
Um,
you didn't need to continue it. That was the other
right.
thing, like
Yeah.
even if it were a big novel, it didn't necessarily have to be a series, and some ideas you really didn't want to pursue beyond the confines of a short story. And the other story I wanted to mention in respect to this was Ursula Le Guin's Those Who Walk Away from Omelas,
Hmm.
which is a book about would you want to base a society that was utopian in every regard, except for it's founded on the misery of one person one wretched person, or
Right.
it could
Right.
be multiple wretched people, but in this particular allegory, it was one person who really, really, really suffered. And there's nowhere else really to go with that
Right.
unless you're a boob and then you want to know, like, well, once they walked away from Malus, what happened then? That's just
A,
utterly preposterous.
a Mayless 2 Electric Boogaloo.
I, I I I don't think that sentence has ever been uttered before.
It's
Uh,
likely. It's likely.
it, and not likely to
That's
be
it's the
voiced again.
kind of wit and wisdom people tune into here on Ancient Geeks.
Exactly, exactly.
Just amazing stuff. Okay.
Can I throw
Did
in a
you?
couple of other things about
No,
like
go right in.
what science fiction felt like at the time? So there's certainly, I think, like people talk about the competent man being the
Yes.
main character of a lot of these stories, and I think that's
And
definitely true.
man being important to that. Yeah.
White man, and um, often also an interestingly melancholy tone. And you really get that with one of the authors that we're going to talk about. But I think it wasn't strictly limited to that person. Um, I think also too, like the experience of reading science fiction, because there was so much of it, and
Yes.
writers were so prolific that you would stick with a writer, that you
Yes.
knew that not everything that they would write would be great, but even with some of the misses, you'd know that there would potentially be some great hits down the road. So it was like you had a particular like a relationship with the author, and kind of you followed them with the expectation that the next thing they would come up with would either be like a continuation of something that you really loved about them, like we were talking about the Amber novels
Right.
last time, or it would be something that would really surprise you.
So did you partake quite a bit of the magazines?
Oh yeah, 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 definitely. I was less of an analog guy
Right.
than I was more, the other magazines that I've mentioned, but I definitely read them.
I was never a regular reader of any of them.
Hmm.
I think I often, especially when I was younger, I was always willing to try something new, but for some reason with short stories in particular, I wanted to know whether I was going to like them or not. So I
Right.
was often cleaving, as you say, to the same authors who were prolific, or unless they became collected in some kind of anthology. I was thinking about this. I prefer novels to short stories. I think that's just generically
Hmm.
true. But I read a lot of short stories early on, and I'll put it this way, I was incredibly aware of the importance of those magazines, and I knew that many authors that I loved only became a known commodity because they first premiered in
Hmm.
S and SF or Asimov or Analog.
Yeah.
I knew the history was very important,
Yeah.
even if I didn't read them regularly.
Do you know what I just realized was one of the biggest delivery vehicles of this particular genre that we haven't talked about? The science fiction book club.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so for those who don't know, because of the difficulties often in tracking these books down, there was a company that would publish kind of relatively less expensive
Yes.
versions of books and also made them available. So, like, if you really fell in love with Edgar Rice Burroughs's Mars series, and you wanted to be able to read all the books, or there was some other author that you'd heard of, but you haven't been able to find in Brentano's or B. Dalton's or whoever the local bookstore was, that could just they would send it to you. You had to buy effectively a subscription to them and have to buy a certain number of books,
Right.
which I kind of, when I was in college, fell behind my payments on one time. I did catch up, but anyway, but it was kind of important, and there are these special editions that, for example, would have like three of the Amber novels in one volume. So
Yes.
yeah, you wouldn't be in the situation of getting the first book and the third book, but you'd lack the second book.
Or even those volumes would be what often would end up in used bookstores.
Yes, exactly, exactly.
They were all they were not quite as they were cheaper cheap in the sense of the production value of the book was not as high as maybe the
Right.
when you buy in the bookstore. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
and
yes,
you wouldn't put them next to your leather-bound volume that collected all the
no,
Sherlock Holmes stories.
no, that's also true.
No.
Although I think I'm pretty sure the edition on my shelf up there, Dangerous Visions, is a science fiction book club
Mm,
edition.
Foreshadowing.
Yes, yes.
Foreshadowing. Okay, so do you want to get into the authors now, or there's anything else you wanted to talk
Let's
about?
see here. Was there anything else? I feel maybe that's it. Yeah,
Okay.
let's move on.
All right, so why don't you kick off with your first author who was
Well,
important to you at the time?
so so let's talk Ray Bradbury. Let's start with him. I think that again, he was a short story writer. I was The Martian Chronicles was something I read very early on. Another source of books, now that I'm thinking about
Yeah.
this, right,
Hmm.
was the Scholastic Book Club,
Oh yeah. Right.
I remember actually I'll even step back because I realized probably the first science fiction book that I read, I probably got through the Scholastic Book Club, and it was Madeline L'Engle's A Wrinkle in Time, which may be,
Hmm.
in fact, maybe it's a fantasy book. I don't know. But that was when I burst. But then I remember getting this edition of the Martian Chronicles and being it was just really it was different than anything I'd read. It's very Bradbury's very I don't know, and I haven't read it again in a very very long time. And I guess I ought to. I did finally read weirdly like many years later. I read Fahrenheit 451, but um, but the Martian Chronicles was very impressionistic. It was very
Hmm.
haunting.
Yes.
And it was, and I also remember do you remember the miniseries they made of it? I don't remember what
Sadly,
network it was
yes.
on. Yeah, that was really weird. It didn't really have a whole lot to do with the book.
Hmm.
That was one of my first early experiences of, oh, if they make a movie out of something, or a miniseries in this case, it may have nothing to do with the book except the
Right.
title and a couple of like, minor things.
Right.
Um, uh, so I assume you read the Martian Chronicles?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The Illustrated Man and
Yes,
Something Wicked This Way Comes. And
yes,
yeah. So he was the most, I think, popular science fiction writer at the time. Like because you could find it, in sort of mainstream
yes.
conduits of literature like the Scholastic Book Club, or there was a movie based on Fahrenheit 451.
Yes. I think too he was considered, I think he still
Mm.
is considered a more the term that we throw these modifiers around, but literary science fiction. I think he was
Yes.
considered more I think he considered himself more a literature guy than a science fiction writer,
Right.
as I recall. It's been a long time since I've read any Ray Bradbury interviews. I remember it
Yeah.
being kind of curmudgeonly and not big on technology. Didn't he?
No.
He blocked electronic versions of his books for a very long time, as I now recall.
Oh, I don't remember that. Maybe.
Um,
So when I was alluding to the most melancholy writer, it was Ray Bradbury,
there you go. I
who
figured
certainly
that was
had these very sad stories.
yes.
Um, you know, for example, like I was thinking, like there's a lot of memorable stories. Like for example, the one "There Will Come Soft Rains," which is just about this automated house that's operating on its own without any
Hmm.
people there. Or
Right,
there's the Veld, the one where there's the wall that portrays the African Veld, and it becomes weirdly real what's out there without giving anything too much away.
right.
Anyway, but it just again, I think if you think that literary means sad, then that would certainly be a suit that would fit Ray Bradbury.
Well, yeah, I well,
His curmudgeonly contours would fit into
uh,
that
yes. My
description.
my my young self, literary used to mean that I wasn't that excited about it, but
Yeah,
was too serious.
it's something you
Um,
had to read.
that's right. I was thinking as preparing for this, right, about having to do book reports and things in school and often not being allowed to read science fiction to do those, which I don't know why the teacher thought that was a good idea, but it wasn't considered serious enough. Although, there were some obvious, which I didn't put on my list, but Vonnegut was somebody that I was allowed to read.
Oh,
It
absolutely. Okay,
was,
yeah.
uh, you know, science fiction adjacent, if not science fiction, depending how you want to look at it. Um, but considers really literary. But
Hmm.
also, speaking of sad,
Yeah.
pretty unhappy stories. Um, Slaughterhouse-Five is not a happy story.
Oh God, no. I mean,
No,
none of his books are happy books, right?
no, not at
Mother
all.
Night. Ooh.
I still, I was allowed
Or
to read. I was allowed to read Breakfast of Champions for a book report in high
mhm.
school. At any rate, that's just a side story.
Okay.
I give it for free.
Yes, because
Who do
that's
you
just the
want?
kind of people we are.
That's right.
Okay, so I'll go on to Bradbury was on my list. I'll
Hmm.
go on to Frank Herbert.
Okay.
Okay, give the people what they want. They want Frank Herbert. So Frank Herbert etched himself on my brain. The first Dune book, right?
Yes.
I have never had to reread that book because
Mm,
I remember everything about it in a weird way that I don't necessarily have the same recall of a lot of other books that I read over the years, including ones that I loved. It was the ultimate big idea book, not just because they had one big idea. Oh, there's this planet, and there's this
yes.
commodity there that's produced, and there's this struggle over it, and it was like multiple ideas. It was ecological science fiction. It was
Yes.
intrigue. It was all these things going on in the book at the same time, wholly unlike anything I'd ever read before. It intimated a lot of, again, talking about sadness, that things were going to come to a bad end, that beyond the boundaries of this particular novel, very
Right.
large novel. And boy, did they come to a bad end in the sequels. It, was a very interesting book to read at a time when I was becoming more fascinated by politics because it was saying a lot about political leadership
Yes.
and how political movements can get out of control. So I think that was, far and away one of the most important books in my early reading of science fiction. Oddly, Herbert, as great as Dune is, I think the books become less laudable, as you go through the
Yes.
later ones. But
Yes.
though I still think the arc of Paul's story, where he becomes, you know, what you think is a hero to someone who's clearly not,
Yes.
by the end of that arc,
Yes.
um, you know, the other books that he wrote were just not really that good.
No.
The White, I was looking at the list, The White Plague, Jesus Incident, Hellstrom's Hive. I mean, these are books I read, but again, as we were talking about uh, just now, they didn't necessarily stick with me.
So, how old were you? How old were you when you read Dune?
I think I might have been around 12.
Okay, I was a little older. I read it in high school.
Hmm.
I don't remember what year. I just know that I was in California at that point, so it would have at least been my late sophomore, early junior year. That
Hmm.
book, I agree with you. And I have reread it. I reread it a couple of years ago, um, and it was still impressive. That it is like the Lord of the Rings in one of these sort of these books that just makes an impact
Hmm.
beyond that you don't expect. I don't know. It is an amazing work. I did read the next book, and then I could not continue. And even I remember the first go around. I don't know if I got past God Emperor of Dune or not.
Hmm.
Because yeah, each subsequent book seemed to lose something. And
Right.
I did try. I know which one it was now. Well, it was White Plague or Jesus Incident. I remember both those books. I remember tried reading one of them and like, I don't. This is. It was
Yeah.
disappointing in that it was not anywhere near the same as Dune.
Hmm.
Um, but it really, yeah, you're right. There's so many different layers.
Yeah.
The
And there,
politics and religion, the ecology.
yeah, I said before it was one of the pleasures of reading science fiction that you'd follow in the wake of a particular writer that you
Yes,
liked. But
yes,
there were also these people who had one really good book or a couple of
yes,
really good books in them, and then nothing else. I think about like one of my favorite science fiction novels of all time, A Canticle for Leibowitz.
yes.
Isn't there's nothing else by that author that
No,
I can
I'm.
remember.
If it exists, I don't even know. That's a good point.
Yeah.
That's a great book,
Mhm.
but I that's all that I ever read was that book by him.
All right. All right. So who's your next author?
So let's see. Let's spin the wheel of authors and let's talk about. Well, okay, I'll pick this one because I don't have a ton to say, but he's very important. So I'll be curious to see. I can't remember if he's on your list or not. He may
Hmm.
not be. So this may be a short conversation. Arthur C. Clarke.
Oh, he's there on my list too.
Clarke is
Yeah.
important. I realized that I read some Clarke because I felt like I had to, but I didn't
Hmm.
read as much of it as there is to read, right? I know I read, and I can't remember which came first, right? The 2001 was a book first in a movie or a movie then a book. I know
It
I
was
read the
a short
short
story,
story. That's what it was.
The Sentinel.
That's right.
Mhm.
And then they made the movie. Then he wrote the adaptation of the movie. And I read that, and I read 2010, but that came before the movie, though, correct? Yes,
What?
2010.
I think that was later.
No, it's later. But didn't he write the book first, and then made the movie? Did he make did
Oh,
his?
oh, oh, oh! I do not remember.
I remember, and then I read Rendezvous with Rama, and I
Mhm,
think I've read some other stuff. I think I may have read Childhood's End.
mhm.
And beyond that, that was kind of it. So I remember
Right.
him being like somebody that was inculcated to me either because of what I read about other authors like, Heinlein and
Mhm.
Asimov, that Arthur C. Clarke's important. Obviously, 2001 itself is important, or listening to, and I know we both listened at least at some point, both Hour 25 in Southern California.
Yeah, so it was a radio show for
Yeah, radio
those who don't
show.
know.
Yeah, radio's this thing where, never mind. It died as a podcast, if that makes anybody happy to understand
Yeah.
that, which I'd never listened to. But so I knew that Clarke was important, but he never grabbed me the way some other authors did. How about yourself?
Yeah, I would say he was one of the most cerebral writers.
Yes.
So I could not recall the name of a single protagonist in any of the stories or novels that he wrote. I mean, I really liked the ideas in the books.
Right.
Childhood's End. Well, human beings aren't the last stage in
Yeah,
evolution.
that's right.
And there's that interesting twist at the end about the other alien species who comes to help us.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. I
yeah,
did read, now that you say that. I read it. I don't remember any of the characters. I remember
yeah.
the overall plot, or Rendezvous with Rama, the big ship and all that,
The
but I
big
don't
ship,
remember
right?
any of the people. The people
No,
did
none of the
not.
people. But the ideas were outstanding often,
Yes.
So the 9 billion names of God was a story that has,
Yes.
just a kind of terrific impact. The meeting with Medusa is maybe my favorite
Okay.
story of his, which combines a couple of really neat ideas, actually. That one I remember not much about the protagonist other than it's I won't go again. Don't want to give anything away, but it's an unusual person, and I'll just leave it there. And the other thing about him too is like he was not only kind of like sort of very cerebral, but Clarke was never really as much a part of the science fiction writing community as other authors. Like we haven't talked about conventions. We're going to probably do a whole episode on conventions,
Oh,
but
sure.
science fiction conventions, comic book conventions, and so forth. But like you'd go to conventions, and there would be these different writers, who were regular features of that community who were there. Ellison and Spinrad and you name it. Niven and other people, but Clarke was kind of always not as connected into that science fiction writing community as some of the other authors were.
It was at 2001 money.
There you go. Like you could just go live in Sri Lanka and
That's
life is good. All right. Anything else about Clarke?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. So
You
I'll pick another hard
you pick
science
one.
fiction
Pick one.
writer, Larry Niven.
Niven. Yes.
Yeah. So Larry Niven is best known for the known space series,
Yes.
which were just lots of very neat ideas meshed all together. About the future of space travel, about aliens, about uh, just some of the interactions human beings would have with aliens and how well or badly that would go. That was a big theme. Things about neutron stars and black holes and all sorts of kind of physics motifs
Yes.
to a lot of the stories. Probably the best known of his books is Ringworld,
Yes.
which is a big idea story that actually weaves in a lot of the other ideas from the known space stories. So a lot of the characters, a
Right.
lot of the references to things that have happened in other books. Really liked it. One
No,
of my faves. One of my
Niven was
faves.
great. It was, I've talked before about how I like world building and the known space
Hmm.
stuff is actually very, I like the integrated nature of those stories.
Yeah.
Ringworld, was great.
Yeah, so
Um,
Ringworld, I think we're not, this is not going to be a terrible spoiler since it's in the
no.
title, but it is an artificially created world. It's just a big ring around a star. And so there's
So
like
yeah,
it's all the questions about like why would you do this? How would you do it?
how would it work? It's like
Yeah,
it's basically it's the same notion as a Dyson sphere, except instead of a Dyson sphere, it's just a segment.
right. Yeah. And
Basically built it basically 1 AU out or approximately from the star, and then
right.
the inside of the ring is the habitable portions.
And there's all the picaresque sort of storylines that, happen when they get to the ring world and
Yes,
start to explore it. So that I think that's deserves its being seen as a pillar of classic science fiction.
the dumbest thing I remember from that, not dumb, it's a dumb thing to remember, is the curse word. Remember the curse word from Ringworld?
Oh, I don't.
It
What is it?
was it was Tang. There ain't no justice.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know why I remember this. These are the dumb things I remember.
Oh, okay. So I also thought like he was
You're not
great.
impressed. Tell me you're not impressed with my memory.
I'm so I'm not saying much more because I'm so
Yeah,
humbled
yeah, okay,
by
well,
how that
fair.
right.
That's
And I'm
sure.
as much as a fan as I am of Niven, I'm a little embarrassed. I forgot that. Um, though I did remember his word for sex between different species.
I don't remember that, so that's
Okay. Um, but he did have the best aliens. I have
yeah,
to
he had
say,
good, he had good
they were
aliens.
really alien.
Yeah.
Like the puppeteers, the
Mm-hmm.
Kazinti,
Mm-hmm.
they're just fantastic aliens.
Yeah,
Uh,
he did a really good job of creating a real universe to explore.
right. With different motivations, different
Mm-hmm.
worldviews, different ambitions. I just great stuff. The technology was interesting, always. The way that you'd imagine creating like a monomolecular weapon, just like a
Oh, that's right.
one
The
molecule thin.
that's right.
Yeah,
Isn't I forget what those are called, but yes.
yeah. All or like all the like the technology, like the super technology of the slaver races that that people would find lying around and then kind of make mistakes and what they do with them with these artifacts. Anyway, just great hard science fiction with again just a lot of terrific twists on aliens. All right, so that's my next one.
Okay, let's see here. Let's talk Heinlein,
Okay.
Robert Heinlein. So I again, like Clarke, I knew he was important and I knew that I was supposed to read him. I read some but not all of his work. I realized that I did. I told you the other day off, on the phone, that I had not read
Hmm.
this, but I did read The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, and I think I read some other one of his early books, but that one I did remember. And then of course Strange in a Strange Land, which is
Yeah.
his most significant work, which I think is a very interesting character study and also sort of an interesting sort of exploration of a big idea about a guy who is raised by aliens and this whole idea that Martians are
Hmm.
real and he comes back to Earth as a sort of this mystical figure who will eventually then, I guess, inform Elon Musk's AI program on X. But oh well. Because of the word grok.
Yes.
And then I remember reading Friday. So one thing that I do remember both about Strange in a Strange Land and Friday is how much the sexual stuff was ramped up in these books, especially in
Oh
Friday, but
yeah.
also in Strange in a Strange Land. So this was new to me in high school, and also in some ways seemed kind of unnecessary. And not that I had any particular objection retrospectively. Friday in particular was just all I did not look at the I did not go back and even look at a synopsis. I just remember it being a book that I felt was
Hmm.
kind of odd and superfluous in some ways and disappointing,
Yeah.
and maybe why I never went back to reading more of his work.
Hmm.
Um, but clearly important. And obviously, like a lot of other authors, he had this very strong sort of libertarian philosophy running through his
Right.
books. Um, what are your Heinlein experience like?
So I would say the ones that I like the best were Starship Troopers.
Yeah.
Um, I I think that anybody who watches the movie is going to have a very different experience reading the book,
Yes.
and vice versa. I mean, the movie was meant to be a parody of fascism. And, while the people have certainly criticized Heinlein's right-wing politics, I think that that would be an unfair description of that novel.
Right.
Though there's an argument in it for limited suffrage, based on you have to be
Oh, that's
a
right. Yeah.
veteran.
Yeah.
But you're playing with ideas. You're not necessarily, kind of advocating that this is the way that the United States should be run. Um, the Puppet Masters was really good. I The Moon is a Harsh Mistress was pretty good. I was not a huge fan, I have to say, of Heinlein. I had the same
No,
experience. Like I felt like I should read this, but I'm not loving it, and the late stuff is really not good.
I may have read
Um,
Number of the Beast as well. Not that I see that on your list, but I have no.
yeah,
That name, the title is familiar.
yeah.
Um,
I
but
think his work doesn't hold up as well as other writers over time.
right, right.
It was immensely well respected at the time. People would talk about Stranger in a Strange Land in hushed tones. It
Sure.
was kind of part of hippie culture too in the
Oh,
1960s.
very much. Yeah.
Uh, but anyway, I just, wasn't in love with him at the time, and I have no idea, no motivation to go back and reread him.
That's fair. I do think, and if we go back to the whole L word literary, I do think of his books, Strange in a Strange Land is somewhat transcendent
Hmm.
and would be part of a, if we're putting together a set of books that one ought to read from the era, that one I think would make it. Some of the other ones are less. Friday,
Yeah,
definitely not Friday.
right.
If
I
you, if,
also, yeah, I
no,
also
no,
think
it's
that
just,
if you wonder why people who are engineers kind of tilt a little bit to the right in their
yes,
politics. I think that Heinlein is an interesting case study because that was his original training before he became a writer, and his sort of right wing bent comes out a lot in the fiction. As I
yes.
said, not in a way that prevented me from reading
No,
it,
no,
but
not at all.
in any case, I think that like if you wanted like to take an exhibit of somebody working through a lot of their ideas, and kind of you want to like trace maybe back to their engineering background, you might look at Robert Heinlein.
That's fair.
All right. Shall we go
Your
move
turn.
on? Harlan Ellison.
Harlan Ellison. Okay, let's start
Harlan
Harlan.
Ellison. So Harlan Ellison was also kind of a special figure in science fiction at the time.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a sort of this enfant terrible, kind of this guy, the angry young man of science fiction, a very
And,
literate person,
and angry middle-aged man
and angry middle-aged.
and
Right.
angry old man.
Yeah, there's a thread there. But somebody who railed against the evils of the world, kind of explicitly in essays that he wrote, as well as kind
Yes.
of through metaphor and a lot of the fiction that he wrote. He wrote one of the most terrifying books, short stories I've ever read. I Have No Mouth and I Must
Yes.
Scream.
Yes.
I wrote other really memorable pull no punches kinds of stories like Pain God and others. Also some funny stories like Repent Harlequin said the TikTok Man.
Yes. Oh,
Um,
yes.
and he was kind of the fixture since, we were in Southern California, a fixture in Southern California where he lived, so he would be at the conventions, he would often intervene to help a science fiction bookstore that ran into financial problems, A Change of
Hmm.
Hobbit. So I remember like going one time when he did this sort of write-a-thon in the front window of the bookstore where he sat there with his typewriter writing stories that were
Right.
kind of intended to be part of this effort to kind of bring business into A Change of Hobbit. He wrote a a very memorable essay that he gave as an address that was effectively about toxic fandom in the science fiction community. So if you want to look at early toxic fandom, I would definitely suggest finding
Now, come
finding
now,
this
Tom,
essay.
fandom cannot be toxic.
They just love too much. It comes from a loving place.
That's right.
It's nothing toxic about it, whatever. I thought his fiction, was sometimes a little bit overwrought, but
Yes.
still really good. He certainly was treated as special enough that when, he wrote one of the iconic episodes of Star Trek, that was a huge deal.
Yes.
And he would often like pop up and write other things. Like there was like an issue of the Incredible Hulk that he wrote
Oh, I
back
did not know
back in the
that.
60s. Yeah, it's worth looking up
No,
on.
he wrote that. He wrote, was it, it wasn't Twilight Zone. Was it Outer Limits, the
Oh,
story
Outer
that,
Limits. I was coming to, yeah.
yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, like the two episodes of the Outer Limits, Soldier and Demon with a Glass Hand that were, really, really good. They were,
Yes.
you know,
Which
outstanding.
led to a lawsuit over the Terminator movie.
Correct. That he claimed that Cameron had stolen the idea of the time traveling robot from him.
Yes.
Or probably a lot of
No,
people
so
already do that, but
yeah, I mean, yeah. Ellison was one that I encountered. I had mentioned Hour 25 earlier. I think, in fact, that's
mhm.
how I encountered Harlan. I mean, I was aware of City on the Edge of Forever as a Star Trek fan, but I
Yeah,
didn't really know who Harlan Ellison was
yeah,
in my early teens or mid-teens, whatever this was.
yeah.
So I remember him being on Hour 25, finding him a compelling figure on the radio,
hmm
and then leading to reading um, a collection of short stories and essays, and then Dangerous Visions also. Um, and he was very, his stories are, they are good at this like one kind of cool idea in the story,
hmm
and then sort of working around that. And I think he also, I think, fancied himself in some ways more literary than anything else. He did take himself very seriously.
Yeah. Well,
There,
yeah, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say for listeners that might be interested, or there is, and I think it's on Amazon Prime Video. There's a documentary about him in his later life, which is
hmm
kind of interesting. It's a little, maybe it sands off some of the rough edges, but it's still, it's still, I think, interesting.
Yeah.
But he was a character, to put it mildly.
Yeah, and well, I think where the upside is of his attempts to be literary was he edited a couple of the best anthologies of
Yes.
science fiction ever, the Dangerous Visions
Hmm.
and More Dangerous Visions, and he clearly put a lot of thought into picking the authors, kind of working with them on the stories that they would publish in that anthology, and the result is, I think, just if you wanted in one place to really see what was great about a lot of science fiction of that particular vintage, we're still talking about the 60s, 70s,
Hmm.
you'd go to those collections.
Yes, that's
They're
correct.
still very readable.
Yes. Agreed. Agreed.
All right, who's next?
Let's see here. Round and round she goes. Well, let's talk Asimov, shall we?
Okay.
So Isaac Asimov was a huge impact on me.
Yeah.
And of course, he was a very prolific author, right? I mean,
hmm
does he still have the record for the most published books or
He
something
might.
ridiculous?
Yeah.
Uh, Granted, both fiction and and nonfiction, including Asimov's guide to practically everything you can think of. Asimov's guide to the
hmm
Bible. I don't know. I didn't read any of those, but um, I came to Asimov, I think, initially from the robot stories.
hmm
I, Robot, and then the rest of the robots, and being
Yeah.
intrigued by this whole notion again of technology and how robots would potentially change or affect humanity, and the whole idea of the three laws of robotics, and how that would
Right.
then try to curtail the robots. And not to make this about contemporary politics, but maybe the AI people need to come up with some rules.
hmm
But nonetheless, that was my entree. And then not long thereafter, Foundation, and the Foundation novels, which were again originally serialized right in some of these magazines we talked about before, but I read
hmm
them as collected works. And was just again like Lord of the Rings, like Dune, the Foundation novels were one of those sort of hallmark moments in my reading childhood. And of course, a whole host of other stories, Nightfall,
Hmm.
and what have you. How about yourself?
So for me, I started also with the robot series, not surprisingly. I think they're the most approachable,
Yes.
I think, especially when you're young. By the way, I remembered something. One of the robot novels has a mystery set in it on a world where people do not want to have face-to-face contact with each other.
Yes. Yes.
So, that it's considered almost repulsive to
Yes.
actually be in the same room with somebody. So technology has so separated them that
Yes.
they'll do virtual representations of each other, but not ever, kind of come into contact with one another unless
Right.
absolutely necessary. We don't live in a world like that,
Not at all.
where
Not
people
at
are
all.
afraid to, like have a phone call from somebody that, please text me rather than actually talk to me. But
Yes. Yes, listeners,
anyway.
please text me first. No, and that's a good point. So
Yeah.
there were the original robot short stories, and then there were the whole series of Lige Bailey novels, and
Yeah.
and his robot partner R.
Our
Daniel
Daniel Oliva.
Oliva, yeah.
Yeah.
And From the Caves of Steel was the first one. That's actually, I'm glad you brought that up because I was thinking about, I was actually thinking about the converse
Hmm.
rather than, I think the one you're talking about is the Robots of Dawn,
Hmm.
where the spacers on that particular planet are all spread out. They have their own like massive uh, plantations. That's not the right word, but they were all separated. They could be around robots and they could also do I think maybe they were holograms. I can't remember.
Hmm.
But the opposite of that is on Earth, where for reasons that never made any sense to me as a kid, that everyone lived in these like really hive-like cities,
Right.
right? The literal caves of steel. Although I
Hmm.
remember reading that Asimov liked small spaces, and that was part of why he did that. I read that many years ago, so maybe I've got it wrong. Because it never made sense to me that like the city that it may have been New York, I can't remember if it was or not, but the city that Elijah Bailey lives in, where you have to have like shared bathrooms
Right.
because you're so compact. But there's all this space outside, and he was very agoraphobic, and he went outside. It kind of freaked him out.
Hmm.
They had the farms and stuff, and the robots worked the farms and whatnot, as I recall. But there was this whole etiquette about like not looking at anyone in they call it the privates, I think. I haven't
Yeah.
read this novel in forever.
Hmm.
But there was like the whole protocol, like you pretended like other people weren't around you when you were in the bathroom, basically. I'm like,
Right.
why would in the future would I not have my own bathroom, man? Come on.
If
Um,
nothing else, if
if
nothing
nothing else,
else,
that's right.
right.
Um,
We all need our own bathrooms.
I think that's fair. Um, but yes, and then the whole idea of going out to the other planets, and then the whole contract between the spacers and the Earthers, and how
Right.
they evolve differently and use the robots differently, right?
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. And then, so from there, I read the things that I think were considered to be the gold standards of science fiction, at the time. So first was the novella Nightfall,
yes,
which has a very simple premise that there's a planet that people are living on because of the array of multiple stars that this planet is orbiting. Uh, there's a very rare occurrence to ever have night, and so night is coming, and it's there's a lot of dread about what will happen when that occurs.
yes,
That this society is not ready for something like that to happen. And then the other, of course, was the Foundation series,
yes,
the the thing that was considered to be, the science fiction series of all time, practically,
yes,
uh, back in the day. And was interesting about it was it wasn't technological science fiction, it was social science fiction. It was
yes,
based on the idea of what if you could work out social science to the point where it could be reliably predictive,
yes,
and then you foresaw that civilization was going to collapse, and what do you do?
yes. No, it's the first three novels in particular are quite amazing.
Yeah.
Although I will admit, I went back. So I've not watched the entire thing yet, but I watched the first season of the Apple TV Plus Foundation
Hmm.
TV series, and I forget how many episodes into the second season I've got to get back to. I'll make a side note. I think it is worth watching. But it is clearly an adaptation, not a. It's inspired by, shall we say? There's
Oh,
not
okay.
because it's one. But this caused me to go back and reread at least part of the first book again.
Hmm.
And I will confess, unlike Dune or a number of other things that I've reread in my adulthood, Foundation, and this may make some people mad, it struck me as a lot less impressive than when I read it the first time.
Hmm.
It was more plotting, lots of talking.
Yeah.
And I was struck by the fact. Now, I will point out that in the robot novels, there is a major female character, Susan Calvin, if I remember correctly. So I'm not saying that
Hmm.
Asimov never wrote women. There are no women in Found. I mean, like they don't speak, they don't exist.
Right.
It's quite striking as a 50 something year old person to read.
Hmm. Hmm.
Didn't hit me at all when I was 15 or 14 or 13, whatever. So,
Yeah.
but it is interesting. But I still, the overall plot, you're right. It's very fascinating. And I love the bit, spoilers for Foundation, um, where the mutant, the mule shows up and throws everything out of whack because you can't predict one
Hmm.
person. You can do these whole massive
Right.
predictions, but you can't. But yeah, and then this mystery in those novels of like, oh, where's the second foundation? And all
Hmm.
this stuff. That's
Yeah.
pretty cool. I remember very, very, very fondly.
Yeah. I haven't reread the novels. It'd be interesting to do that. Hmm. Okay. And so the other things I mentioned about Asimov, I think, are, that he had the science fiction magazine with
Yes,
his name on it, which was pretty important at the time. And he was a great science popularizer. The reason that
he
he
was.
that he wrote so many books was he would just like tear off one article after another about some scientific topic, and they were collected into books, and there you had it. Just lots and lots of books
But
aside from his fiction.
while he was able to popularize science, he was not able to popularize those mutton chop facial hair thing that he had going.
Thank God. Thank God. Yes.
Uh,
As a scientist, he had the chops,
but as a fashionista,
and he didn't have them.
no.
Okay.
Or he had them, but he shouldn't have.
He was also
I
like he's somebody who definitely did not take himself too seriously.
That's true. That is true.
Yeah, because the opposite of the more literary
I think
kind of
that's
people
totally
in
fair.
this genre.
Um, and I noticed on your notes it's worth talking about. Yeah, he does later write a bunch of prequels and crossovers. He connects the robot stories to the Foundation stories. I'm
Yeah,
not really quite sure how well that worked, but I do
not
remember
too
them doing.
well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it felt like a fun gimmick,
Yeah.
that he
Yeah.
did,
Yeah.
but didn't really work. He did write actually one of the saddest stories for a guy who didn't take himself too seriously, and I'm putting him on the opposite end of people like Ray Bradbury. The Bicentennial Man is a pretty sad story,
It is. It is.
but a good one.
Yes.
All
Yes. It
right.
is. It is a good one. Yeah.
Okay, so you chose Asimov. I don't necessarily have to go through everybody I put down
Right.
here on the list. I want to talk actually about one author that maybe people haven't heard about. So there's, I've still got like other names people have certainly become acquainted with, maybe just in passing, but Alfred Bester. So he wrote a couple of books that were just, I would say, roller coasters of imagination. And one of them was The Demolished Man, which was about how do you commit a murder in a society of telepaths.
Mhm.
It was sort of that interesting gimmick. And the other one was The Star Is My Destination, which was a revenge story with, a different kind of psychic power being central to it. Like, what if people could actually develop the ability to teleport? But both of them highly imaginative books, almost like reading detective fiction or noir fiction,
Right.
in both the tone and in the case of the Demolished Man, just like genuinely being a thriller about committing a crime where it shouldn't be possible to do so. Star Is My Destination had these like crazy text things that he did, like putting like the text of one page in a spiral that wound into itself on one page as uh, wacky things are happening in the story. So I think he was like an example of one of the many writers necessarily who didn't come out of this as being famous, but are worth going back and rereading. And certainly I loved at the time. And so like sometimes somebody like on Reddit or someplace else will say like, well, what authors do you think I should read as classic science fiction? And some of them you'll have heard of, certainly like Frank Herbert and Isaac Asimov and so
Right.
forth. Some of them that you may have heard of, like Harlan Ellison. And some of you probably definitely have not heard of, but should seek out, like Alfred Bester. And he had some other like short stories like Fondly Fahrenheit that were really fun about a murderous robot. But anyway, a writer I just wanted to mention as
No,
both good in of himself and exemplary of a lot of the people who get
my
lost in the mists of time.
my main association with Alfred Bester is that was the name of the character that Walter Candy played on Babylon 5, and it was an homage to this author.
Yeah, exactly.
Um,
Because that character was psychic.
yes, yeah,
Yeah.
telepath. I mean, I know the names of those two novels,
Hmm.
but that spiral thing tickles my brain. Like maybe I did read The Stars My Destination because that really seems
Hmm.
familiar to me, but now maybe I
Yeah.
just read about it somewhere. I don't know.
Yeah.
Um,
There was a good comic adaptation of it with by Howard Chaykin.
okay, maybe I read that. Hmm. It's a good title regardless.
Yeah, it is. Also, like those two books have very these mnemonics in them that you read the book and you're likely to remember them for a long time because they keep coming up over and over again.
Gotcha.
Like Gullyfoyle is my name and Terra is my nation. Deep space is my dwelling place. The star is my destination. How I remember that, I don't know.
Just
Because
well, I
I have a
mean,
weird brain, Stephen. I
I
just have
was
a
I think
collection of
there's
useless
definitely
knowledge rattling around in me.
I was gonna make fun of you, but I'm making fun of myself at the same time, right? I mean, if we do
Yeah.
take all of this useless information, how much real useful information have we crowded out of our brains, filling it full of all this stuff? But hey, it's all
Frightening.
good.
All right. Do you have
Um,
anybody
no,
left on your
I
list?
think the only thing that I'm gonna mention is I'm gonna mention Douglas Adams.
Okay.
Um, because The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which I mentioned in the previous podcast, I originally counted as a radio series, but those books are also um, very, very significant in my young life. And that was one of those, unlike some of the other stuff that was written before I was born or when I was
Hmm.
younger and I could find, that was something that was coming out and I was excited to like, oh, it's at the bookstore.
Hmm.
Often as a surprise. I didn't always know there was going to be another book, and then there it was.
Right.
But The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy was, the first time I think I had encountered humor of purposeful humor in science fiction, but in a way that
Hmm.
was, and also to fully appreciate Douglas Adams, I think you have to have a certain amount of previous science fiction knowledge to really appreciate it.
Right.
So I think he spoke to the young geek in me at the
Hmm.
time because of the way in which he lampooned a lot of this stuff, but in a very smart way.
Yeah.
And there's also some great politics in there that I came to appreciate later in life.
Hmm.
Anyhow, that's one. I read a bunch of Star Trek novels as a kid too. Those were very
Hmm.
important because at the point at
Yep.
that time that seemed like that was all there was going to be.
Right.
All those,
Oh yeah, definitely.
pocketbook, Timescape, Star Trek
Hmm.
novels.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Some of them were quite good.
yeah, some of them are very good, very very
Yeah.
good. Anything else you want to mention before we
So
talk about?
I'll just mention quickly Philip K. Dick.
Okay, yeah, oh, yeah,
I can't, we're running out of time. I can't really do
yes.
the guy justice, but
No, he's great.
I think he was somebody who'd like really, again, stretched the boundaries in a different direction. In this
Yes,
case, this incredibly pessimistic view of the world, that
yes,
pops up in different ways in different books, Flow My Tears, the policeman said,
yeah,
the Man in High Castle, whether
yes.
it was drugs that alter reality or time travel or whatever, or, alternate history. It's all these different things that could,
Or he had great titles. I mean, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep is a great title.
yeah, it's awesome.
And that's also another example of, because I'd seen Blade Runner
Yeah,
because Han Solo was in it.
right,
Um, and then I read the book later. Like, again, these are like totally different works.
right. And that's fine.
Yeah, it's totally
Yeah,
great. It's totally
yeah,
great.
but they're very different.
I've read The Man in the High Castle. I never saw the TV series, but
Hmm.
yeah, but Blade Runner is just such a different book, an entity. It's just a wholly different creation than that book.
Yeah, but just this extremely unsettling view of things. It's
Yes. Oh no,
almost
he
like
was.
almost like cosmic horror. That like
Oh
you
yeah,
can't trust reality.
yeah.
Often
That's true. He
just
wasn't. He doesn't strike me as he was great fun at parties.
no. He actually came into our bookstore one time,
Did he?
and yeah, and he was an odd guy. Uh, and the other person I wanted to mention was Ursula K. Le Guin.
Yes.
Who I think wrote one of the most uh, cautionary tales with The Lathe of Heaven.
Hmm.
Uh, there's also a good public television adaptation of it.
Really?
You
I'm
could you got
unaware of that.
you can seek out. I think it's actually on YouTube somewhere. But anyway, so the concept of the novel is if you could really shape reality, and the mechanism of the book is that there's somebody who has this sort of mutant ability to do it through his dreams. What he
Yes.
dreams then becomes reality. Um, would that be a good thing? Like
Right.
how good intentions could go very badly in sort of a monkey's paw like way of wishes turning bad.
Yes.
Um, and her other work, which is very literary, is also very good. The Dispossessed
Yes.
and others in the Earthsea trilogy. And anyway, I wanted to mention because she was also somebody who made a big impact on me. But there are so many other authors. I made a quick list. Other people we're not talking about who were fun or had a good idea but didn't necessarily write a lot of books. So we mentioned a couple of those already. Another one like Earth Abides, another post-apocalyptic novel by a guy who didn't write a lot of other things. Or Bring the Jubilee, that was another one. So anyway, so Keith Lummer, Frederick Pohl, Anne McCaffrey, Gordon Dixon, Clifford Simak, Joe Haldeman, Harry Harrison, E. E. Doc Smith,
Mm.
Poole Anderson, we talked about in the last episode,
Yes.
Fritz Leiber. I mean, there's all people who wrote great stuff, and it's a shame we can't talk about all of it, but there's only so much time and patience on the part of our listening audience here.
Yeah, I think that's the main commodity we're burning up is patience for the audience. Not, I think that's the case. Yes.
All right. So, what merch did you have?
So, I'm better prepared this week. Although I have one thing that came to mind, and to my delight, I found it on the internet. So, and again, like with the previous discussion about fantasy novels, there wasn't, in my mind at least, you know, action figures or whatever. There were other books, and so one bit of merch that I'll highlight is Barlow's Guide to Extraterrestrials. You remember this?
Oh, yes. I love that book.
So, yeah, that, and to my disappointment, I must have gotten rid of it at some point in various moves. But I will say, for those who care, the Internet Archive has it archived, and you can find it online. And that was where, even though I didn't necessarily read all of these books that we've talked about, that I encountered a lot of the aliens. And that
Hmm.
kind of book was the kind of thing that really tickled a little space in my brain because it was like,
Hmm.
as I mentioned early on, I think maybe as far back as Origin Stories in our first episode, the research element of this is something that I always found fascinating that you could find more stuff out. And so a book like that was a huge example of merch that was really important to me, even if I didn't read all the books that it was talking about. It was just really cool.
Right.
But it
Yeah.
also intersects with your point last week about how artwork was so important
Hmm.
at the time.
Yeah. And I think what I said last time about the book covers being part of the
Yes.
merch. Yeah. I mean, and I mentioned Michael Whelan last time. I'll mention him again, but wasn't the only artist. Kelly Freas and older artists like Virgil Finlay and Stephen Fabian, just these terrific artists. Again, it wasn't necessarily like a movie that or a comic book that depicted
Right.
everything. It may have depicted just like one important moment from a particular story or a particular book, but it did it in such a visually striking and evocative way. There were also, I would say, for my merch, I had albums that included the authors reading their stories
Ah,
or
yes.
like other actors, Shatner and Nimoy. So you'd like Asimov would read something from Foundation or Shatner would read something from Foundation. Anyway, those were pretty great. I also have from the
Not the
time of
Ballad of Bilbo Baggins, though. That's a different problem.
no, no. Um, you know, my uh, parents did a series of interviews with science fiction writers who came through,
Yes.
and I have the tapes of those. And I have no idea what to do with them, but I just have something I have
I
in
still think
storage.
there's
But
got to be a way to podcast those.
yeah, we'll figure it out eventually. Um, and then there are also like there were a lot of board games at the time that were tie-ins to science fiction. So like there was a Dune board game in the
Right.
1970s done by the same people who did Cosmic Encounter, if you've ever played that game. Um, anyway, so that was some of the merch I had. Was there anything that you wish you had?
There's always with all of these different space stories, some kind of physical manifestation of different ships and things would have been cool to have, but didn't exist. So it was all in the imagination, which is its own advantage. But yeah, nothing beyond that. That's kind of it, right? Just
Yeah.
always more books and more in any kind of physical manifestation of, especially spaceships, were always something I was interested in, but
Hmm.
didn't exist.
Yeah. I would not have turned my nose up at action figures based on Larry Niven's Aliens.
That's good. Yeah.
That would have been cool. All right. A little bit of the on the legacy of the writers we're talking about, aside from the merch, just kind of prefacing when we get into talking about games more. As I mentioned, all the board games, there were also lots of science fiction uh, role-playing games at this time, Traveler being the most famous one, but not
Yes.
the only one. There was also the pairing by the same guy of Metamorphosis Alpha and Gamma World, two post-apocalyptic science fiction role-playing games. In fact, I think Metamorphosis Alpha was the second game that TSR published. I'm not sure about the chronology of that,
Remember
but
Gamma World,
yeah.
but
Anyway, so
not
yeah,
the other one.
Metamorphosis Alpha was the same thing as Gamma World, but it was on a spaceship.
I see.
So it was like the Star Lost, effectively.
Okay. Okay. Okay.
There's a deep cut for there was a science fiction
I do remember.
show based on that Harlan Ellison created that was a spaceship where people didn't know they were on a spaceship.
I remember Traveler. I had Traveler.
Yeah.
Um,
Um, movies and TV, there was 2001, as we talked about before, which has a huge, huge cultural imprint.
yes, it does.
Um, but not a lot of adaptations of the books that we're talking about until Lynch's Dune movie.
No, Lynch's Dune, and then the later, more recent Dune. Um, I mentioned the Martian Chronicles miniseries, which was
Yeah.
forgettable. Um, I mean, again, there've been attempts at Asimov adaptations, although like I never
Hmm.
saw it, but the Will Smith I, Robot, I think the only thing it had to do, the only similarity was it had the name I, Robot.
Right.
Certainly was not the same thing.
Hmm.
I think in the foundation, I don't, you've not watched it, correct?
No, I haven't.
I think it's good. It is good. It's well done. It's beautifully rendered, and there's some, but the best parts in some ways are things that are not from the novels.
Hmm.
Um, so it provides a basis, but not a direct adaptation. But anyway, I can't think of anything like
Yeah,
any
there.
Niven's work, except the closest I can come with is an episode of Star Trek, the animated series with the
Yeah.
Kazinti in it. But beyond that, um, it is kind of funny how some of this stuff has not been adapted.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly there was always talk about doing, some of these stories as movies that never got, beyond the
Yes.
development stage, like Rendezvous with Rama. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think people I think in Hollywood just need something to be a hit, and then they can, kind of follow on with something that then they're sure is commercially successful instead of taking something risky like Foundation would have seemed at the time,
Yes.
and say, well, we're going to do a straight version of this as a mini series with the same budget as Roots. Like, hmm,
Yeah.
maybe
Right.
maybe that would be a stretch. It's like, we'll fund this Shogun story instead. How about that?
Oh yeah, I mean, if we're talking about, I'm sorry, I was kind of thinking even about sort of even recently, but yeah, if we talk
Hmm.
about adaptations in the miniseries format or what have you at the
Yeah.
time,
I'm kind of surprised that actually the Martian Chronicles got made.
yeah, that's true.
It did have Rock Hudson in it.
That's right, it did. I'd forgotten that.
So there was an effort to try to make it a marquee bit of
Hmm.
television there. All right. Well, are we wrapping up, I
I
think?
think we're wrapping up.
We are wrapping up. Or would you live in a Philip K. Dick inspired reality where we can't be sure that we're wrapping up? Or that
It's
you're
always
really you,
it's
or I'm really me.
it's always the risk. There is no escape.
All right. Well, this was big, and I think that you'll see the connections between the last episode and this episode with a lot of the episodes to come. The
Oh yes, there's
written
plenty of places
written
to
science,
spin off.
yeah, written science fiction and fantasy for both of us were huge, and I think in general they were huge for inspiring what was to come.
Agreed.
Okay. That does it for the latest episode of Ancient Geeks. Thanks for listening. Next time, we'll be talking about Marvel Comics and our favorite heroes when we were younger. Please leave us a review when you get a chance on the podcast app or service of your choice. Not only do we crave attention, but we also very much appreciate the feedback. And by all means, tell a friend. That's the best form of recommendation of all. If you have feedback, suggestions, outrage, anything that you want to tell us, directly contact us at someancientgeeks@gmail.com. Look for us on Reddit, Facebook, Blue Sky, and other social media outlets. All content is copyright 2025, Tom Grant and Stephen Taylor. Music by Reversed Image, whom you can find on Pixabay. See you next time.